Lewis Wetzel was born in 1763 to a family of German immigrants in Pennsylvania. His family, like many others, headed west looking for a better life. They settled on the edge of Native American territory and built a farm. Lewis's father was a farmer, which was unusual for this area where most men hunted, traded, or fought. Life on the frontier was tough, and settlers often clashed with Native Americans. One day in 1777, while John Wetzel was working in the fields with his 3 sons, George, the eldest, was already grown and worked alongside his father, even carrying a gun. The other 2 were Lewis and Jacob. John sent Lewis and Jacob to the cabin to check on some venison and bring back a rifle for him and George. But just then, a small group of Hurons decided to rob the cabin. They attacked the boys as they came out the door. Lewis was shot in the chest, the bullet piercing his lung. The Native Americans easily took the boys' weapons and began ransacking the cabin. They grabbed some metal pots and ran off, taking the tied-up boys with them. Their father and brother heard the shots and knew immediately what had happened, but they had no chance of fighting off the attackers without weapons. They ran to the fort for weapons and help, but it was too late to catch the Native Americans. Native Americans often kidnapped women and children. It was a common practice. While women and girls faced a grim future as slaves, boys were often treated quite well. Many tribes believed that a kidnapped child could replace a lost relative, so boys were raised as their own, as members of the tribe and family. And many white children eventually adopted Native American culture and stayed with them forever. They didn't run away, even when they had the chance, especially if they had been captured very young. Of course, this wasn't always the case. Children could be beaten to death, burned at the stake, and tortured in all sorts of ways, but still, white children in tribes weren't unusual. Okay, so back to Lewis, the guy who got shot in the chest. Even though he was in a ton of pain, he knew he had to keep up with the Native American group. It was a matter of life or death. On the 3rd night, the Native Americans got a little careless, probably thinking the boys were too far from home to try anything. Just to be sure, they took their shoes, but the teens still managed to escape in the middle of the night. Lewis knew they wouldn't get far without shoes, so he told his little brother to hide while he snuck back to the camp and swiped some moccasins that were drying by the fire. Feeling bold, he also grabbed his dad's rifle and a horn of gunpowder right under the nose of a sleeping Native American. Now their odds of survival were way better. Of course, the Native Americans woke up and chased after them, but the boys managed to lose them 3 times before they reached the Ohio River. It was wide and fast-moving, but they built a raft out of logs tied together with strips of bark. And remember, the older one was only 13 years old, and he'd been shot in the lung. They traveled a long way through the wilderness and somehow made it across the river, where some kids from their village spotted them while fishing. That's how the brothers got home. Lewis's wound healed quickly, but this whole experience really changed him. He started practicing a lot with a long rifle and became an amazing shot, but his real talent was reloading his gun while running. It was incredibly difficult back then. To fire a shot, you had to pour in the gunpowder, load the bullet, tamp it all down with a ramrod, a lot of steps. Doing that while running was almost impossible. Soon enough, at 14, Lewis got a chance to use these skills. His dad sent him to warn a neighboring family about some hostile Native Americans that had been seen nearby. On the way, he ran into a guy named Fraser, a woodsman who'd been hunting small game and was heading home. Fraser had just gotten married and didn't want to leave his young wife alone for long. Since Fraser's cabin was along the same path, they decided to travel together. When they got closer, they realized the cabin was on fire, and Fraser's wife, Rose, was nowhere to be seen. Lewis checked the tracks and figured out that 4 Native Americans on foot had taken her. The men took off after them. The Native Americans lost time building a raft to cross the Ohio, while Lewis and Fraser swam across, holding their rifles above their heads. It was getting dark, and they were about to stop for the night when Lewis smelled smoke. A few hours later, they were near the Native American camp. Rose was alive, tied to a tree, crying. 3 Native Americans were asleep, and one was sitting with his back against a tree. Fraser was furious and wanted to shoot them right then and there, but Lewis said they might hit Rose, so they decided to wait until morning. They kept watch all night. Eventually, Rose fell asleep. During that time, the Native Americans changed guards and built up the fire again. That's when they noticed one of the Native Americans was actually white. Probably another kidnapped kid, or maybe even a renegade. At dawn, Lewis and Fraser waited for the men to wake up. Their plan was to shoot the first 2 as they got to their feet. The white guy got up first, followed by the guard. The shots rang out and both men fell to the ground. Since their guns only held 1 shot, Lewis and Fraser pulled out their knives and tomahawks and charged towards the fire. The remaining Native Americans woke up and ran off in terror, leaving their weapons behind. Fraser stayed with Rose, who was hysterical, while Lewis continued the chase. He saw that 2 of the Native Americans had stopped running and were holding tomahawks. Lewis stopped, raised his rifle and shot one of them. The other one immediately charged at him, knowing he wouldn't have time to reload. Lewis ran and started reloading on the move. When the Native American got close, Lewis turned and fired without aiming. The man fell to the ground. After the fight, Lewis and Fraser took 4 scalps from the Native Americans and headed back home. It was during the height of the scalp hunting days, and they could get good money for them. After the incident with the stolen horses, Lewis became known for his survival skills and his ability to fight Native Americans, but also for his cruelty in taking scalps. He became a kind of headhunter, attacking Native Americans and taking their scalps. Over time, his behavior became more and more eccentric, and he even began to resemble a Native American himself. Eventually, he was wanted for killing a chief, but thanks to the support of the people, he managed to avoid punishment. With the coming of peace with the Native Americans, Wetzel's star faded, and he died at the age of 45. He was buried in the yard of his cabin, and his remains were later reburied in the cemetery next to his brother.